Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Ukraine, the EU, political crisis, and Russia, all four in the news in a big way for a good reason. Kiev's decision to walk away from the EU's association agreement has infuriated Brussels. Many are pointing the finger at Russia, and Ukraine is in turmoil. But what is not talked about much is Russia's idea of a customs union comprising of post-Soviet states, an alternative of sorts to the EU. To talk about this and more, I'm joined in London by Charles Crawford. He's an international negotiations consultant who previously served with the UK Foreign Office in Russia in the early 1990s and then in Poland from 2003 to 2007 as British ambassador to Warsaw. We also have Hervik Osanyan, visiting lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Relations, the University of Westminster. On the phone, we have Rilka Dagneeva-Luvers. She's a senior lecturer in law at the University of Birmingham. And here in Moscow with me is Natalia Vochkova. She's a professor at the New Economic School. Okay. Charles, can you explain to our listeners what is the custom union?
Well, I think you have to start with the fact that you have to start with the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, you had a strange situation. You had the European Union and NATO, which were both organizations which had developed over decades, really, in stable conditions in the western part of Europe. And then you had all these new countries emerging who had been in a framework of sorts, either within the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact, and had to find some sort of role. And Russia set up the Commonwealth of Independent States as some sort of an attempt to bring those former countries into some sort of framework. That's never really sort of taken off as an idea. And I think the basic problem with Europe is that there are too many countries and not enough clubs. And the clubs that exist, such as the EU, are very difficult to join. So what's happening is that Russia is trying to set up, with other former Soviet republics, a new form of economic space, which has some of the echoes, the formal integrative aspects that the EU has as well. In other words, it's going to have a certain normative content, which is something quite different to what they've had before.
Over in London also, a lot of people use shorthand and say this customs union headed by Russia is a counterbalance or a different version of the EU. How do you react to that?
Well, on the one hand, Russia very much uses the language of economic rationality to justify the reintegration of the former Soviet space. And of course, if you look at...
Okay, but reintegration in an economic sense.
Yes, in an economic
sense. Stressed here.
Sense. Okay. And that is very much the rationale that is put forward. But I think that what's occurring in the background is Russia's hard realist geopolitical thought and the thought of Russia and that hard realist kind of thinking that permeates Russia's elites being translated into this economic form. What I mean is that Russia's elites fundamentally think in a realist manner. They look at things. They have a very strong sense of their geopolitical environment. And what they are trying to do basically is, to some extent, reconstruct the sphere of influence that they feel historically and for a number of strategic reasons to be rightfully theirs. I think that the customs union must first and foremost be understood in terms of these geopolitical factors more than anything else.
But it's also quite interesting is that you can buy a trainload of coal in Kazakhstan and have it all the way sent to Belarus, and you're in the same economic space. I mean, this is, again, this rationality. I mean, it's more than geopolitical. We see all around the world the major powers constructing custom unions and trade pacts. NAFTA is a good one. The United States is thinking of another one for the Pacific, excluding China, importantly. I mean, there is a geopolitical one there, but there's also a very rational economic one. Rilka, if I can go to you on the phone, Hillary Clinton said, I think it was almost exactly a year ago now, that Russia is trying to recreate the Soviet Union. How do you react to that?
Well, if the Soviet Union stands for centralized state built around a particular ideology to unify a region, then absolutely not. Such a view fundamentally, I believe, misunderstands the origin, the logic, and the development of Eurasian integration, at least in a few ways, if I just give a couple of examples. Firstly, the whole project stops short of political integration, monetary integration, citizenship. So far as what we understand, the future treaty of the Eurasian Union is going to exclude these. The other thing is that decision-making is highly centralized, and ultimately, despite some delegation is carried out by the Council of Heads of State. So sovereignty actually matters to heads of state very much. It also operates in a very different domestic and international environment. Domestically, the project is based on the current domestic institutions, which ultimately favor preservation of the power base and price flexibility. And it would be mistaken to believe that either Lukashenko or Nazarbayev are purely pawns in the integration game. Mm-hmm. And internationally, it actually does introduce international standards. It has been instrumental in paradoxically modernizing a country like Belarus in the area of customs legislation. So I would, on this occasion, on this definition of the Soviet Union, disagree.
Okay, Natalia, it was very thorough there. That was very interesting. Let me go to Natalia here, my guest here in Moscow. Just for our listeners here, what is the difference between this customs union and the European Union? What is the difference between the two?
So as far as European Union concerned, that definitely this is the major example that customs union applies in all spheres of integration that happens now between Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. We advise Eurasian Commission from my school and my colleagues, we advise on several aspects. And one of the first requirements from Eurasian Commission was, please study very carefully European experience. And
meaning, if I can just jump in here, do you mean avoid the mistakes?
One thing, be very careful in putting down the problems that currently or earlier European Union experienced in order to avoid them. On the other hand, find the vector of integration that were very successful, and the idea behind Eurasian integration is to go along those successful stories as fast as possible. And for example, a lot of things that were already done, they were done much faster than it happened in 80s, 60s, 70s in European Union. And this is what people, bureaucrats in Eurasian Commission tell us with pride, because this is what they use as an example, as a benchmark. This is very important because so far this is the most successful regional integration project.
But I would, if I could jump in here, that's a political project. And Charles, I think this is the significant difference between the two, is that this customs union, it has virtually nothing to do with politics at all. There isn't a parliament, and there isn't there is a commission that deals with trade issues. However, it's extremely decentralized. In a sense, if you can agree or disagree with me, you get what you put in.
Well, I think I wouldn't go so far as to say that these things have nothing to do with politics, because trade and money and who does what to whom and under the conditions are all very political. I think the strength of the customs union idea is that it's fairly easy to join. Why is that? Because the obligations under it are not that far-reaching, whereas the European Union obligations, in a sense, if you want to join the European Union, it's a vast, mass of rules and laws and harmonies and goodness knows what, so it's much harder to join. But on the other hand, if a country wants to join this customs union, there's no sort of real preconditions for its level of democracy or the way it runs itself, so you could end up in a situation if say, Ukraine...
Charles, do you think that's a positive or a negative? Because...
I think it's easy in the sense...
Because we heard with the case with Ukraine, it was a civilization choice. And I think that was, if you look at the underlining message there, right there, is that, European values are better than everyone else's values.
Well, I think they're different. And I think if you join a union in which there are lots of countries which don't make any serious attempts to practice democracy and are right towards the top of global corruption leagues, the officials appointed to these institutions, the way the whole thing works will be psychologically very different. And there is if you like, you want to call it that, a civilizational aspect to this. The problem with the European Union is that it really is very integrated now, and not everyone likes that. It only has one voice in world trade talks, for example. That an awful lot flows from that. You can say that's just economic, but it's also very political as well.
Kavert, how do you feel about that? Because when we look at the customs union that's being developed here in the post-Soviet space, I've talked to people about it, and there's a disillusion, there's a great disappointment with the World Trade Organization, for example, because still the largest, most powerful countries get their way. But when you have a customs union in fledgling economies like in the post-Soviet space, which has done pretty well since the end of the Soviet Union, on par. Go ahead.
You do, but the different logics between the EU and the customs union lie precisely in the fact that the EU was a horizontal integration project from the very beginning, whereas the customs union is a top-down project. that is very much driven by Russia, with some input by Kazakhstan and a little bit more reluctantly by Belarus. Russia simply has both the carrots and sticks within that geopolitical space to vigorously promote that project. And
you still agree that Belarus and Kazakhstan get something out of it?
Yes, but in case of the other states, it's very interesting that, for instance, they would have to harmonize their tariffs with Russia's, and for some of the states, many of the states, these tariffs are actually their own tariffs are actually lower at this point. So they would actually have to violate their obligations towards the WTO, which call for ever lower tariffs, when they join the customs union, and that raises a question: what kind of incentive, or what are the carrots and sticks that Russia is using? The fact is that you've had two dramatic U-turns by states that were slated to join the association agreement with the EU, who negotiated for years on those agreements and then suddenly changed their minds.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Natalia, sitting with me here in Moscow, you've been shaking your head, no, no, no. I mean, again, the European Union has its own series of carrots and sticks.
I can't agree completely with what was said about the vertical type of integration in customs union. And there is some misinterpretation from my perspective. And for example, the tariff setting, the external tariff is a very good example. When you look at the figures, it might be seen that this was driven by Russia. But careful study of the overall tariff schedule, it was done by Ervik Mkurchan from European University Institute, showed very, very precisely that the weight of Russian tariffs in the overall tariff setting is much lower, like twice as low than the economic weight of Russia in the overall economic union. And the weight of Kazakhstan and Belarusian initial tariffs has much higher weight than the economic weight of those two countries. So the careful study shows that this is not completely correct, that Russia was strongly behind this tariff schedule. Okay. And what I find over last year very interesting phenomena, which was to some extent disregarded when people discuss customs union and further development of customs union in Eurasian economic space, is that this customs union, being economic union, first of all, it brings very interesting political change. That now those free leaders of free, quite autocratic states, they now compete politically between themselves when making decision on further integration, further movement of this integration. And this is very interesting because this kind of competition, it goes back to economic competition in free countries which, beside this, without this customs union, has very little space for this political competition.
Rilke, if I can go back to you on the phone, one of the interesting things is that when we look what happened with the Ukrainian U-turn is that, you have to look at both deals that are on the table. And I suppose really when you get down to it is which bloc you can harmonize with easier and better. And we have the ethnic issue, of course, with Ukraine being divided. But when you look at Kazakhstan and Belarus and Ukraine, I mean, they have still enormous commonalities just because of the Soviet legacy.
Well, yes, indeed. However, again, if you look at the deals on the table, the customs union currently offers the opportunity to Ukraine to preserve existing trade ties. But in terms of actually modernizing institutions, it doesn't do a lot because currently the customs union as it is has become an external tariff, has introduced new substantive customs legislation, but ultimately it relies on existing domestic institutions in order to implement all the obligations of the customs union. And as one of the previous speakers rightly pointed out, there isn't any requirement to modernize these institutions. So ultimately, Ukraine may choose a deal which in the short run is cheaper, but it is not actually getting a deal that would help it change and modernize its existing political and economic institutions. And I think this is the sort of longer-term picture that people have shorthanded by referring to civilizational dialogue and civilizational choice.
It's a very good point, Charles. I mean, I think that's a really excellent point there, because I think when I look at the political elite in Ukraine, and I'm thinking about the Party of the Regions in the East as well, the people that have been strongly behind this in the last half year, they would like to have their cake and eat it too. They would like to have institutional reform, and they would like to maintain their existing trade ties. And this is what's not happening right now.
Well, I completely agree with the last speaker. I think this is a very profound point. It might be wise over a sort of 50 or 60 or 100-year cycle for Ukraine to, so to speak, take the hit now in terms of some sort of economic openness in favor of a systematic attempt to improve its institutions. This is the whole drama across the whole former communist space, is how you take, you know, incredibly repressive and centralized and basically bad arrangements and modernize them, because there are winners and losers in this process, and it's just painful and difficult, and we've seen this in Poland and Serbia and all the places I've served in. So I think that aspect of it has to be part of it, and I think this is sort of ultimately what's driving the demonstrators in Kiev. I think they're feeling that if you end up in the customs union, you're ending up in a deal which is worse in terms of democracy, transparency, control, freedom, those sorts of things. And I think if I were, you know, and I think Russia too, you know, can benefit from thinking a lot harder than it's doing at the moment about how to move in that direction.
Okay, but at the same time, if I can go to Rebecca and also in London, when you look at Yanukovych's situation, I have these conversations about civil society and democracy and freedom of speech all the time, and I personally don't find them very valuable, because people vote with their pocketbook, and people vote about what they can buy and what they can, and because they can't buy something, or they're thinking about their families. I mean, I've lived in this part of the world for 25 years, and it's the hard issues that drive people to make decisions. And I think I actually I have no great liking for Mr. Yanukovych, but I can understand his decision. The country is in recession, and now it was being asked to take even a harder hit that could last a decade, according to some economists. That's a hard choice to make.
And interestingly, it's the Ukrainian East that is most exposed to the Russian market, and that would be most vulnerable if Ukraine would lose out. There's another factor here as well. If I'm not mistaken, Yanukovych is due for re-election into 2015, and that might also have played some role in his calculations, namely that if he would join the European Union, there would certainly be some pain, economic pain in the short term, and that would certainly affect his chances for re-election in 2015. So that might probably that would probably also play a role. But it's interesting that people talk about the civilizational choice here, because I think that everyone, in Moscow, in the EU, in Brussels, in Kiev, understands that this is what fundamentally the customs union versus European Union conflict is about. It's about a choice of values, conflicting values.
Okay, Natalia, you're disagreeing?
Absolutely. I don't see how, if we talk about economic terms, this is just not true. And I have all grounds to believe that economic integration in customs union, if it will be successful, it will bring political change as well, because this is how business will react on these on new opportunities. And at some point, when political constraints will become the bottleneck for economic development, business will help to overcome this. And the way how currently things develop, it's also about changing constitution in customs union. And this is not true that the thing tried to recreate Soviet Union. It was surprising for me to see when we started studying the obstacles for integration, how different free countries developed in their regulatory way. And now the thing is how to change regulation using as a benchmark European Union. I believe that this kind of change in regulation, which definitely affects the way how bureaucrats deal with business, deal with the economy, that will also bring the institutional change. And this is why this European Union being highly regarded by all bureaucrats in Eurasian Commission as a very good example, the best example that they try to follow up. This is very important for future institutional change in these three countries.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia from the heart of London. On weekdays, we broadcast live from 4 p.m. until 8 p.m. We're bringing news, current affairs, features and debate. Now you can listen to us on digital radio and online. Visit ruvr.co.uk.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Okay, if I can go back to you on the phone, it seems very interesting when we look at, again, the example of Ukraine, the reason why we're doing this program to flesh out what customs union's all about. But if you're a Ukrainian, you're kind of, everyone there is kind of like, everyone wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. I think everybody knows where they want to go, but it's the which painful path do you take, I suppose?
Well, the customs union is not necessarily a painless path. There's still things to implement. They still need to comply. The problem with the customs union at this moment is that it tries to develop at a huge speed with the single economic space being added on. There is a very ambitious agenda, a new treaty being negotiated, new legislation being adopted. It is actually not necessarily... There is, at the moment, as we look at it, it is not clear how the new treaty will look like and whether the promise that Putin is making will be delivered. And at the same time, the economic price for Ukraine is not necessarily clear, other than we will restore trade ties. So it is true that probably Ukraine is choosing what is less painful at the moment, but the customs union still has to deliver. And my sense from talking to the Eurasian Economic Commission, for example, which indeed I agree with Professor Volchkova that is full of very gifted professionals, but my sense is that they are underestimating the problems of implementation, especially if you have such an ambitious agenda for both widening, adding new countries, and deepening, adding new policies for harmonization.
Yes, of course, and if people want to join it, they're going to want to join a winning bloc and not a losing bloc. Charles, one of the big issues in the news on the back of this Ukraine story is that the Ukrainian leadership, Russia has also suggested to Brussels to have a trilateral commission to work out the issues of all concerned, and this has been rejected out of hand by Brussels. I mean, isn't politics the art of the possible? I mean, can't the European Union say, "Yeah, I can see how this could kind of irk your neighbors. Maybe we can sit down and hash this out." But they're absolutely rigid about it. Are they correct?
Well, I think they're correct in the terms, the way the thing is set up. And I would tend to, privately, I suppose, think that, part of the difficulties, as I said before, is that the European Union is now so complex, it's very difficult to join it, except on the terms of the complexity. So there is a case for the European Union as part of its wider reform process, which it's going to go through in the coming years anyway, because of all sorts of obvious reasons, thinking in a more creative way about how it can deal with both Russia and Ukraine and that part of Europe, which is which has been in the communist world, and particularly in the USSR communist world, which was very different from the Warsaw Pact communist world. I just don't think, going back to where we were on the civilizational points, though, that you can easily separate out the economic aspects of integration, which sort of are fine as it goes, without looking at issues like the way prosecutions work, corruption works, money flows work. There's just an awful lot of strange things going on in the former USSR communist space, which are actually very bad and damaging to Russia as much as to other countries. And unless they are seriously tackled, and I don't get a sense of the customs union putting this forward as a priority, because why should they? Their countries represented there don't want these things tackled. That is going to be a major obstacle.
Do you want to reply? Because that's a very interesting point. Because because you're taking the position that the customs union will create new habits and get rid of bad habits. Because that echoes with me, because I've lived in this part of the world for 25 years, and change comes slowly if it isn't pushed hard and made clear what the new rules are. Go ahead.
I agree that customs unions itself will never discuss or handle corruption in free countries. However, if we take economic institutions where corruption is very deeply settled down, like customs themselves. We see now that being without internal customs and only free customs on the borders, Belarusian, Kazakhstan and Russian there, the business, for example, Kazakh business that faces corruption at Russian borders, they start complaining to Nazarbayev to take this issue, to bring this issue to the discussion at very top level, which never happened before. So I think this kind of economic competition between among free businesses like Russian, Belarus, and Kazakh ultimately might be a very important tool that will push down political change and institutional change in terms of corruption. And this happens not only in customs. The same happens in various regulatory offices like sanitary and phytosanitary inspections, tax inspection.
Oh my goodness, it sounds like the EU.
Yes, that's, because now business concerned with business in one country concerned what happens with institutions and administration in another country. And this kind of, it is without political and democracy and political institutions that drive this political change, it might be a very important tool that should not be disregarded.
Do you agree with that? Because it seems to me that, if there's a demonstration effect here. I mean, if it's the customs union is going to succeed, it has to be attractive to other members. And there's a lot of post-Soviet space countries, post-Soviet countries out there. And of course, we're not talking about the Baltic republics. They're already in the EU, but there's still a lot out there to market.
I'm very reluctant to compare the EU and the customs union directly. One very important difference is the centrality and the overwhelming weight of Russia within the customs union, and that in itself is a major point of distinction with the EU. Germany does have a lot of weight within the EU, but it cannot be in any way compared to the role of Russia within the customs union in terms of demographics, in terms of economic weight, in terms of political importance. So again, this is very much a Russian-driven project rather than something that spontaneously emerges from within the post-Soviet space.
One of the great advantages is the movement of labor as well. Rilke, we're almost out of time here. I mean, this is one of the things that the customs union likes to wave a flag for, because they can say, you can move around this economic space for labor, which of course is not that easy in the EU. Even if you have a close association with the EU, you don't have necessarily free labor movement. Is this something that's going to certainly will probably attract some other countries to join?
Well, it might, again, depends how it is implemented. The devil is indeed in the detail, and if the current Russian attitude to immigrants from Central Asia is something to go by, it is clear that there are problems, practical problems that need addressing before indeed the benefits of such a freedom are realized by new entrants.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia from the heart of London. On weekdays, we broadcast live from 4 p.m. until 8 p.m. We'll bring you news, current affairs, features and debate. Now you can listen to us on digital radio and online. Visit ruvr.co.uk.
Out of time here, I want to thank my guests in London, Charles and Kirvuk, and on the phone we had Rilke, and sitting with me here in Voice of Russia's studio is Natalia. Thank you. You've been listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with VOR.
Warsaw Pact, and had to find some sort of role. And Russia set up the Commonwealth of Independent States as some sort of an attempt to bring those former countries into some sort of framework. That's never really sort of taken off as an idea. And I think the basic problem with Europe is that there are too many countries and not enough clubs. And the clubs that exist, such as the EU, are very difficult to join. So what's happening is that Russia is trying to set up with other former Soviet republics a new form of economic space, which has some of the echoes, the formal integrative aspects that the EU has as well. In other words, it's going to have a certain normative content, which is something quite different to what they've had before.
Over in London also, a lot of people use shorthand and say this customs union headed by Russia is a counterbalance or a different version of the EU. How do you react to that?
Well, on the one hand, Russia very much uses the language of economic rationality to justify the reintegration of the former Soviet space. And of course, if you look at...
Okay, but reintegration in an economic sense.
Yes,
in
an economic
sense. To be stressed here.
Sense. Okay. And that is very much the rationale that is put forward. But I think that what's occurring in the background is Russia's hard realist geopolitical thought and the thought of Russia and that hard realist kind of thinking that permeates Russia's elites being translated into this economic form. What I mean is that Russia's elite.
Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Ukraine, the EU, political crisis in Russia, all four in the news in a big way for a good reason. Kiev's decision to walk away from the EU's association agreement has infuriated Brussels. Many are pointing the finger at Russia, and Ukraine is in turmoil. But what is not talked about much is Russia's idea of a customs union comprising of post-Soviet states, an alternative of sorts to the EU. To talk about this and more, I'm joined in London by Charles Crawford. He's an international negotiations consultant who previously served with the UK Foreign Office in Russia in the early 1990s.
Fundamentally think in a realist manner. They look at things, they have a very strong sense of their geopolitical environment. And what they're trying to do basically is, to some extent, reconstruct the sphere of influence that they feel historically and for a number of strategic reasons to be rightfully theirs. I think that the customs union must first and foremost be understood in terms of these geopolitical factors more than anything else.
But it's also quite interesting is that you can buy a trainload of coal in Kazakhstan and have it all the way sent to Belarus, and you're in the same economic space. I mean, this is, again, this rationality. I mean, it's more than geopolitical. We see all around the world the major powers constructing custom unions and trade. And then in Poland, from 2003 to 2007, as British ambassador to Warsaw. We also have Hrvik Osanyan, visiting lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Relations, the University of Westminster. On the phone, we have Rilka Dagneeva-Luvers. She's a senior lecturer in law at the University of Birmingham. And here in Moscow with me is Natalia Vochkova. She's a professor at the New Economic School. Okay. Charles, can you explain to our listeners what is the custom union?
Well, I think you have to start with the fact that you have to start with the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, you had a strange situation. You had the European Union and NATO, which were both organizations which had developed over decades, really, in stable conditions in the western part of Europe. And then you had all these new countries emerging who had been in a framework of sorts, either within the Soviet Union or the